I never imagined that my own son's birthday gift to me would be a broken bottle against my head, and a scream wishing I would rot while I was still alive. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because we publish new stories every day. Leave a like, and tell us in the comments what city and country you're watching from. My name is Ann Evans. I'm 61 years old, and if I dare to tell this story today, it's not for drama or out of spite. It's because I learned the hard way that the cruelest betrayal doesn't come from strangers, but from the blood you swear to protect. What happened that evening in Chicago completely changed how I understood family, love, and even my own dignity. It was September 12th, 2021. I had prepared an intimate dinner, nothing extravagant, just a few close friends and some family to blow out the candles on another year of life. There were 70 chairs reserved in a discreet hall on the outskirts of the city, although fewer ended up coming, about 50 guests, between familiar faces and some neighbors. I was content, at peace, because after the pandemic, I had found human warmth in these gatherings again. We were making a toast with wine when my son Michael walked into the room. From the first moment, I knew something was wrong. He wasn't the smiling son who should be congratulating his mother. He arrived with a wrinkled shirt and red eyes, a mixture of alcohol and boiling fury. He walked like a bull ready to charge. When I approached him to say hello, without even kissing my cheek as he always did, he grabbed my arm tightly and whispered in a tone that only he and I could hear. "You're giving me $400,000 today, or this ends badly." I tried to stay calm. I answered in a low voice, asking him to respect the moment, that it wasn't the time or place, but he couldn't handle the refusal. He took one of the reserve wine bottles from the table, and in front of the guests who were still applauding the toast, he smashed it against the rim of another glass and then against my forehead. A thick silence fell over the room. I felt the glass cut the skin above my right eyebrow, the warm blood running down to my lips, and then I heard the scream I will never forget. "You should rot, you miserable old woman." Some guests tried to approach, others stepped back in horror. My daughter Sarah, a geriatric doctor, ran immediately to help me, but I stopped her with one hand and forced a smile, with the blood still trickling down. "It's all right, this is a gift too," I said, with bitter irony, to avoid a bigger scandal. I took a deep breath. That second of self-control is what saved me from becoming a passive victim. I chose not to return his violence or his words in front of everyone. If I broke down in front of them, Michael would have the victory of humiliating me in public. I preferred to become silent. The muffled laughter of some neighbors, the discomfort on the faces of friends. Everything became a blur as Sarah discreetly led me to a side room. She cleaned the wound gently, almost crying, and kept repeating, "Mom, you have to report him. This isn't normal, it's not just a simple outburst." I nodded, but in my heart, I felt that this wasn't just an explosion of anger. It was a piece of something bigger, a chain of disrespect that had been building for a long time. That night, as the room emptied and my friends left with their heads down, I made a crucial decision. I wouldn't react hastily, I wouldn't file a report immediately, but I also wouldn't just turn the page like I had other times. I had to observe, investigate, wait for the truth to reveal itself. Because if my own son was capable of raising a broken bottle to me and describing me as something that should rot, the wound on my forehead wasn't the most dangerous one. The real wound was opening up inside my family and in the shadow of my own assets. That night, with my forehead bandaged and the silence of the room still ringing in my ears, I knew that what was coming next would be worse than a physical attack, and I understood that I could no longer trust Michael as a son, but as an adversary. It was just the beginning of a battle that would define my life. When I closed the door to that side room and the murmurs of the guests faded away, I felt the world crushing me in silence. Sarah insisted on taking me to the hospital to get stitches, but I refused. I just asked her for some gauze and a little ice. I didn't want this to end up in a police report that same night or on the front pages of Chicago's digital news the next day. I preferred to carry my physical pain and remain still, observing, instead of reacting with rage. And there, against that bathroom mirror, with a makeshift bandage, I discovered something that would be key. Serenity could be a more powerful weapon than any hasty complaint. In the following days, the wound began to heal, but people's stares remained wide open. Some friends called with short, uncomfortable phrases, not knowing whether to offer support or pretend they hadn't seen anything. Most chose silence. Only Sarah maintained a calm, almost defiant firmness. She, who had grown up around scalpels and emergency rooms, kept telling me that Michael's assault was not an accident or a simple fit of rage. "Mom, this is a sign that something worse is coming," she told me, with clinical certainty. I nodded, although I was torn inside. For decades I had tolerated demands, small acts of disrespect, unpaid debts. I even found my forged signature on a minor document back in 2017, but I swept it under the rug to avoid starting a war within the family. I thought that time and affection would straighten what was bent, but that broken bottle showed me the harsh reality of my mistake. Unlimited forgiveness isn't a virtue. It's food for the tormentor. Meanwhile, Michael didn't apologize. Not a call, not a note. Just silence. That emptiness was even more painful than the blow. A week after the party, I found him at my building's entrance. He was leaning against the wall, with a messy beard and his phone in his hand, taking long drags from a cigarette. When I tried to approach him, he blurted out, "Have you thought about what I told you? You can't keep hoarding everything while I'm drowning in debt." I didn't answer. I looked at his face again. He looked less and less like the little boy I had taken to school with his backpack hanging and a sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil. He was another man. Dark, cold, ready to destroy instead of build. I closed the door without saying a word. That was my first silent victory, resisting the provocation without granting him the power of my anger. The nights became heavy. I would wake up with the memory of his scream in the hall, of the blood running down my forehead. I would walk barefoot through the empty house, mentally reviewing the last conversations I had with him before the disaster. Everything fit a somber tone. Urgent requests for money, unexplained trips, vague promises that everything will get better next month. I had accepted those lies, believing I was helping him get back on his feet, but in reality, I was paving his way toward a more dangerous ambition. One Sunday, Sarah came for breakfast. The table smelled of freshly ground coffee and toast, but her expression was serious. She sat across from me, and lowering her voice, she let out a secret that chilled me to the bone. I overheard Michael and Jessica talking in the kitchen at their house. They didn't know I was there. "They're planning to have you declared mentally incompetent, Mom." And Samuel Miller, that lawyer who's always around Michael, offered to prepare everything so they can take over your estate. The cup trembled in my hands. I felt the bitterness of the coffee mixed with a lump in my throat. The assault with the bottle had only been the surface. The real depth was this cold, calculated plan to strip me of everything I had built in my lifetime. I then understood the true viciousness of the move. It wasn't just greed. It was annulment, erasing me legally from the map, reducing me to a shadow with no control over my own assets. I looked at Sarah, and I saw in her eyes the calm of science and the fury of a daughter who cannot stand injustice. She was 29, but in that moment, she seemed older than me, holding me up with her firmness while my world fell apart. I took a breath and swore in silence that I would not allow such an outrage. But my revenge wouldn't be screams or violence. It would be intelligence, patience, strategy. Over the next few weeks, I adopted a different routine. I pretended everything was normal in public, but in private, I began to organize my papers, review deeds, locate contracts. Every document I opened reminded me of a brick of my effort. The lake house, the farm in rural Illinois, the apartment in Chicago. Everything could be blown to pieces if those vultures achieved their goal. I spent hours in my office, lit only by the monitor's glow, reconstructing every financial move of the last few decades with surgical memory. I couldn't leave any loophole for their trap to slip through. Nor could I raise suspicion. Michael was impulsive, but Jessica was cunning, and behind her apparent sweetness hid a calculating mind. The wound on my forehead was healing slowly, but my heart was burning. More than rage, it was determination. In the silence of my house, I repeated to myself over and over, "They are not going to steal my dignity or my history." And so, hidden behind my daily routine, I began to plan my next move. What Michael and Jessica didn't imagine was that I was no longer an easy prey. They believed that the bloodied woman at the party would die of shame inside, ready to give in under pressure. But they were deeply mistaken. What was born that night was a silent adversary, and in that silence was my most dangerous strength. Discovering from my own daughter that a plot was brewing against me was like feeling another bottle break inside my chest. But this time the cut didn't bleed on my skin, but in my soul. During those days, everything around me took on a new shade, as if the past words and gestures of my family had to be reinterpreted again and again in a different light. I remember, with uncomfortable clarity, certain scenes that I had previously preferred to bury in my memory. In 2017, for example, a rental contract appeared with my name and signature on it. I had never signed it. I overlooked it, convinced it was some administrative error. Now I realize. That was a test run, a trial to see how far they could manipulate without consequences. Images of Jessica, my son's wife, also come to mind. Ever since she entered our family, I sensed a strange magnetism. She would smile delicately at birthdays. She would help serve the table, but at the same time, she found the exact phrases to plant guilt in my silences. "Anne, you have to support your children, no matter what," she used to repeat every time I hesitated to grant Michael another loan. At the time, those words seemed like advice. Today, I identify them as part of a very well-woven narrative designed to weaken my authority. Over time, all those anecdotes began to fit together like pieces of a terrifying puzzle. It was no coincidence that Michael insisted on asking me for increasingly larger sums, nor Jessica's timely interventions defending his cause. Everything pointed to a slow-burning plan, cooked up between whispers and knowing glances. Sarah watched me whenever I got lost in my thoughts. Her concern was evident, but so was her respect. At lunch one day, as she broke bread with steady hands, she told me softly, "Mom, we can't ignore what I heard." Jessica spoke with a coldness that froze me. She said you were already too tired to hold the reins and that a psychiatric report would be enough to get you declared incompetent. Hearing that, I felt a mix of disgust and sadness. It wasn't just about money. It was a direct attack on my sanity, on my identity, to annul me as a person, to reduce me to an invalid signature on a court paper. That's when I began to become aware of my own vulnerability. On the outside, I looked like a whole, lucid woman with full decision-making capacity. But in court, with 3 twisted testimonies and the complicity of a corrupt lawyer, they could turn me into little more than a piece of furniture. And what hurt them most was that this threat didn't come from strangers, but from my own flesh and blood. That night, I revisited even older memories. I saw myself in 1994, at the school gate, with Michael crying because he had fought with other children. I defended him like a lioness, picked him up from the ground, and proudly took him home. How could I reconcile that image with this man who now planned to destroy me? The contradictions in my head became unbearable, but among the tangle of feelings, something emerged clearly. I couldn't remain silent, nor could I act clumsily. I needed allies and evidence. I needed a strategy. Sarah was the first pillar I could trust, but she also told me about someone who could help. Raymond Vance, a private investigator with experience in family cases, a former patient from her hospital she had once treated. She suggested I contact him. I, who had resolved my own conflicts for so long, hesitated to turn to a third party. However, what was at stake was not just my well-being, but the future of everything I had built for future generations. I accepted the idea. "Bring Raymond as soon as possible, but don't let anyone know," I told her. Sarah nodded with a firm gesture. The following days were a kind of tense pause. Michael didn't show up at the house, although I knew from others that he was still frequenting bars and clubs in Chicago. Jessica remained discreet, sending polite messages from time to time, as if nothing had happened. It was clear they wanted to keep me distracted while they cooked up the final blow. Meanwhile, I feigned normality. I walked through the market, greeted neighbors, and even allowed myself to smile. But inside, a silent operation was beginning. I reviewed every safe, every file, every deed deposited in my office. It wasn't just a matter of legality, it was a matter of memory, because each property title represented years of work, sleepless nights, days of sacrifice. I would not allow those papers to become dead metaphors, trophies snatched by greed. When I finally met Raymond, at the end of September 2021, I was impressed by his simplicity. He wore a worn jacket and an old briefcase, far from the cinematic image of detectives. But his eyes conveyed experience, a calmness similar to that of a surgeon before an operation. He shook my hand and, without beating around the bush, confessed, "Your daughter told me, 'You are in danger, Mrs. Evans, but we mustn't rush. This isn't solved with a light complaint. We need solid evidence and time.'" For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of confidence. I was no longer alone against the void. Now, Besides my daughter, there was an external witness willing to bring to light what had until then been mere suspicion. That day, as the afternoon faded in Chicago and the lights of a historic neighborhood flickered in the distance, I made a firm decision. I would not allow indignity to settle in my home. The blow from the bottle had been only the first sign. What came next was a cold war, a chess game in which I had to move my pieces prudently, because I understood, with the certainty of women who have lived long enough, that when betrayal dresses up as family, only intelligence and silence can restore the dignity they intend to take from us. The arrival of Raymond in my life was like opening a window in a room that had been breathing stale air for years. His analytical, measured, and unadorned manner reminded me of old masters who didn't need to shout to command respect. After that first meeting, I began to recall scenes from the past that I had filed away in a corner of my memory, and which now, under his practical gaze, took on a disturbing meaning. There are memories you keep wrapped in excuses. For years, I repeated phrases to myself that softened the evidence. Michael is going through a rough patch. Jessica is just trying to mediate. That document signed in my name isn't that serious. But the mind has a curious mechanism. When it starts fitting the pieces together, it shows the seams with brutal honesty. I went back mentally to December 2017. That's when I received a letter at home from a bank demanding payment for a personal loan that I had supposedly requested. The sum wasn't huge, but the moral blow was. Reviewing the file, I saw my forged signature and a contact address that wasn't mine. Michael denied everything, and Jessica, with chilling composure, looked me straight in the eye and swore it must have been an administrative mix-up. To avoid a family scandal, I chose to settle that debt and file the matter away. Today, I clearly understand that was the first test of a much deeper persecution, to see how far they could go without me reacting firmly. I also remembered Jessica's insistence during my gatherings with friends. She always found a way to slip in comments about my fatigue, my lack of energy to manage so many assets at a certain age. She disguised her ideas with a loving, even motherly tone, but underneath pulsed a repeated message. I was going to lose control sooner or later, and the one to take over would logically be her husband. I didn't see it at the time. Now, with the perspective of years and the information Sarah revealed to me, it all fits. They were messages planted little by little to justify, when the time came, the seizure of my assets. While my mind was immersed in these recollections, Raymond proposed a plan. He suggested observing without raising suspicion, collecting clues instead of confronting them directly. "Haste is the worst enemy," he would say. And I, who had learned to survive by being prudent, understood that his strategy was the most appropriate. Sometimes I'm surprised by the precision with which I remember smells and sounds from those days. The scent of old paper in my office as I reorganized folders, the click of the pen as I signed old deeds, the distant bells of a Chicago cathedral marking the hours while I tried to reconstruct my history on a table laden with files. There were nights I barely slept. The image of the bottle shattering against my forehead returned like a hammer, but that fresh scar also served as a constant reminder. I had to end the condescension that had brought me to this point. How many times had I forgiven abuses disguised as mistakes? How many of my silences had been capitalized on by Michael and Jessica as opportunities? Raymond, meticulous, asked for access to old emails, agendas, even printed WhatsApp conversations I had saved almost out of habit. He began to identify patterns. Requests for money made at exact moments, unjustified trips to Chicago coinciding with meetings at law firms, notary offices open at strange hours. His ability to connect details was astounding. Sarah looked at him with admiration, and I felt a mix of relief and bitterness, realizing that the enemy had been at my table for so long without me daring to see it. I remember one day, in particular, late October 2021. Raymond arrived with his worn briefcase and showed me recordings obtained legally, but very discreetly. In a downtown coffee shop, Jessica was talking with Samuel Miller. The conversation revolved around medical certificates and the possibility of bribing a psychiatrist to create a report of cognitive decline about me. When I heard my name in that recording, accompanied by phrases like, "She's old now, she won't be able to resist for long," I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't paranoia or interpretation. It was naked reality. Sarah, upon hearing it, broke into silent tears. I hugged her even though my own chest was trembling. Perhaps for the first time, I saw real panic in her eyes towards her brother, not just concern. For her, as for me, Any shred of trust had been broken. The blood tie had been poisoned. After that afternoon, I swore to myself that the next step had to be to secure my inheritance. It wasn't just about defending dollars or properties. It was about safeguarding my identity, my life's work, and above all, protecting the only daughter who still stood by my side. In the following days, as Raymond continued to expand his collection of evidence, I began an internal journey through my own memories. I opened photo albums, a little Michael running on the beach, a smiling Jessica at the first Christmas we shared together. I felt a mix of nostalgia and rage, observing how those happy images had been the disguise for the future tragedy. In the solitude of my house, I repeated to myself over and over that I shouldn't leave room for self-pity. If I remained in melancholy, they would win. And the truth is that this determination gave me unexpected strength, like an old oak tree battered by storms but still standing tall. I resolved to resist and strike at the exact moment. I understood with absolute clarity. The time had come to stop being an indulgent mother and become a strategic adversary. And I wasn't driven by revenge, but by dignity. I would not allow them to manipulate my memory, my actions, or my will. From that moment on, every revisited memory ceased to be a simple story from the past and became a weapon against those who wanted to dispossess me. And so, between ghosts of yesterday and certainties of the present, I took a decisive step. I was ready to face, with no other compass than calm and intelligence, those who had tried to destroy me from within my own family. The day I decided to put a definitive lock on my vulnerability began like any other. Bitter coffee, silence in the kitchen, and Sarah reviewing medical reports at the table. However, my insides were boiling with a different kind of determination. The time had come to draw up a clear strategy. It was no longer enough to accumulate memories or confirm clues. I needed to make concrete moves. Sarah had shown a loyalty that went beyond filial love. She wasn't just caring for me as a daughter and a doctor. She was my confidant, my guide in the labyrinth of this conspiracy. That morning she spoke to me again about Raymond with a serene conviction. "Mom, everything we've seen so far is useless if you don't protect it legally. Raymond can watch, but what will truly prevent them from taking what's yours is to secure it in an instrument they can't overturn." I knew it. I had spent weeks reviewing balances, deeds, stocks, rural properties, and the total number was as cold as it was exact. Almost $3 million in assets accumulated over 4 decades of effort. No figure justifies the tears shed with so much sacrifice, but that amount was the reason that excited the greed of Michael and Jessica. That same afternoon I went to Raymond's office. The investigator listened to my fears and, with his characteristic calm, proposed adding one more ally. An honest lawyer. Someone outside the circle of corruption that revolved around Samuel Miller. I hesitated, fearing that any new name could be leaked, but Raymond guaranteed it. "Mrs. Evans, I know a notary in Milwaukee, discreet, with integrity, far from Chicago. He can help you without raising suspicions." I accepted with a brief nod. Sarah smiled with relief. And so, in secret, we laid out the plan. She would be in charge of my health and emotional well-being. Raymond would handle the evidence against my enemies, and I would coordinate the legal protection. The days that followed were of feigned normality. I ran into Jessica at a supermarket, and we faked smiles. She mentioned that Michael was traveling for business, as if I didn't know he was wandering through dark bars looking for lenders. Her mask was perfect, but her words were hollow. I nodded, like someone listening to an irrelevant tune, while inside I felt a wall of steel growing. In late November 2021, we traveled to Milwaukee, using the pretext of a medical visit to throw off anyone who might be curious. There I met the notary, a man of sober appearance, with rectangular glasses and hands that had the calm of someone who has written thousands of wills. I explained my situation in detail: the assault, the suspicions, the recordings obtained by Raymond, the plan for incapacitation. I didn't need to exaggerate anything. The facts spoke for themselves with brutal honesty. He listened to me for over an hour in his office lined with books. When I finished, he pronounced with a grave voice, "What you need is to establish an irrevocable trust. If you do it correctly, neither your son nor your daughter-in-law will be able to touch a single dollar, even if they try to have you declared incompetent. The management will be in Sarah's hands, and, in the future, your granddaughter will also be able to inherit securely." I felt a strange relief, as if a heavy slab was loosening from my shoulders. For too long my estate had been a weapon in the hands of others. With this mechanism, it would become a shield, a safe place. The paperwork wasn't simple. For several weeks, we reviewed inventories, updated values, organized titles. The process was slow, almost surgical, but each signature brought a little more peace. Meanwhile, Raymond continued to weave his web of evidence. Recorded conversations, documents recovered from office trash cans, suspicious bank movements linked to Samuel Miller. What was admirable was how Sarah maintained her balance. At breakfast, she would talk about patients and medical conferences, preventing the stress from consuming me completely. And when she saw my mind cloud over, she would repeat tenderly, "Mom, you're not alone. They are not going to win." In January 2022, after completing all the legal reviews, the trust was registered. The notary shook my hand with a phrase that still resonates. "From now on, your estate is secure. Only the law can move it, and it is in the hands of those you trust." That night I slept differently. For the first time in months, I rested without nightmares of broken bottles or threats in dark hallways. I woke up at dawn, opened the window, and breathed in the cold winter air. I had taken a crucial step. I was no longer a helpless old woman. I was a strategist in the heat of battle. Of course, the battle was far from over, because while I was consolidating my defense, Michael and Jessica were intensifying their moves. Rumors came from common friends. Hasty conversations with doctors, frequent visits to Miller's office, discussions about properties that still belonged to me. What they didn't know was that every step was being carefully documented by Raymond. I remained calm. I learned to listen without showing surprise, to feign cordiality on the street, to accept hypocritical hugs without giving any hint of my plan. I felt like an actor in a play where everyone believed they were in control of the script without suspecting that the final word was already written in my favor. In that January of 2022, I finally understood that blood does not guarantee loyalty. The real strength was in recognizing the betrayal and responding with intelligence. Sarah, with her young hands and her steady gaze, represented the future. Michael, on the other hand, had chosen the dark path that would lead him to the abyss. Jessica was his accomplice, his poisonous shadow, and I, from my silence, had begun to lay the trap that would finally reveal their true faces. The first months of 2022 became a game of shadows. I felt that every step I took in public was being watched from some corner, as if Jessica and Michael sensed that something was brewing behind my back. However, what they didn't know was that I was no longer on the defensive. The legal protection was secured, and what came next was the most delicate part, gathering solid evidence that would prove the magnitude of their conspiracy. Raymond displayed an almost obsessive rigor. He would arrive with his worn leather briefcase, sit in my office, and without raising his voice, tell me about the progress. Every word he said reminded me that we weren't improvising, but building a meticulous case. He had discreetly placed recording devices in key locations. Coffee shops where Jessica met with Miller, the lawyer's own office, even in Michael's car, with the help of a specialized contact. I listened attentively, feeling that my entire life had turned into a criminal investigation. One afternoon in February, Raymond showed me an audio file. In it, you could hear Jessica's voice, clear and unwavering, saying, "The incompetency petition must be filed in March." Miller assures us that 2 purchased psychiatric reports will be enough. If we file it before Easter, no one will suspect. Hearing that, I felt as if my own name was burning in flames in a secret room. Sarah, who was with me at that moment, shuddered. She knew medical protocols well and understood what it meant to falsify diagnoses. It was a double betrayal, moral and professional. Her indignation grew when Raymond pulled out an envelope with printed emails, obtained through internal leaks. In them, Miller detailed to Jessica a plan to move properties into third-party names so that, once I was declared incompetent, everything would be under Michael's control as legal guardian. That evidence was a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a son blinded by greed. It was an architected conspiracy in which the lawyer provided the legal facade and Jessica contributed strategic coldness. Michael appeared in the conversations as an angry pawn, anxious for immediate cash, but the gears were turned by Jessica and Miller. For weeks, we dedicated ourselves to collecting every piece of this perverse chess game. Raymond showed me restaurant bills where meetings had been held, bank statements showing anomalous income linked to Miller's firm. He even uncovered a receipt for a cash payment for legal fees, on which Michael's handwriting was shamelessly displayed. All of it turned my stomach, but at the same time, it reaffirmed my position. I wasn't crazy. It wasn't the imagination of an offended mother. It was a tangible, documented network that would soon be brought before the justice system. Meanwhile, I maintained my role as a serene woman. I greeted my neighbors, visited my farm in Illinois, attended church on Sundays. Michael was convinced that his outburst with the bottle had been forgotten and that my silence was synonymous with weakness. Jessica, always polite, sent me messages with rehearsed phrases. "Anne, we should talk about your peace of mind in the future. Think about resting." I would reply with monosyllables, feigning passivity. Inside, I had already understood that every word from her was another stone in the trap being set for me. Towards March 2022, Raymond considered that we had enough evidence to file a formal complaint, but he warned me with icy calm. "If you file the case now, they still have room to destroy evidence. We must wait a little longer, gather more details, so that when the blow falls, it will be definitive." I agreed, although the wait was eating me alive. The tension grew daily. I slept little, and when I did manage to sleep, I would hear in my mind the recording of Jessica talking about bought psychiatric reports. I would wake up sweating and walk through the dark house in the early morning, going over the strategy in my head so as not to falter. During that same month, Raymond obtained what he called the master key, a short video obtained thanks to a discreet camera in a shared office space where Samuel Miller was discussing with Jessica the exact price to be paid to two specialists to sign off on my supposed dementia. The lawyer, in a grave voice, said, $1,500 each. "They'll have the paper in 2 weeks. That's enough to ruin your mother-in-law." When I saw that pixelated image on my screen, I felt a mixture of revulsion and clarity. There was no longer any doubt. It wasn't a suspicion. It wasn't a misunderstanding. They were legally planning my burial as a conscious person. That night I talked with Sarah for hours. I confessed that I felt divided. On one hand, the rage for the son I had raised who was now betraying me. On the other, the strategic serenity of having protected my assets with the trust. She told me firmly, "Mom, it's not just your inheritance. This goes beyond that. This is about defending your dignity against those who want to erase you." Her words sustained me in the midst of the whirlwind. They reminded me that the most important thing wasn't the money, but maintaining my status as a person of integrity, capable of making my own decisions until my last breath. At the end of that month, Raymond delivered a detailed report with dates, transcripts, and documents. We kept it in a plain folder, with the certainty that it would soon see the light of day at a police station and in a courtroom. I, who had always believed in resolving family problems within the home, understood that this was no longer an intimate conflict. It was a crime, plain and simple. And so, in that spring that was beginning to bloom in Chicago, as the trees in the streets released their fragrance, I felt the moment was approaching to move from defense to counterattack. I was no longer the wounded woman bleeding at a party. I was a mother waiting for the right moment to strike back with the force of the truth and the law in my hands. The day I decided to turn evidence into legal action, the morning broke with a biting cold. I had spent weeks gathering evidence with Raymond, organizing folders, listening to disgusting recordings, reading emails that showed the betrayal in all its rawness. However, making the decision to give them legal form required an emotional leap. It meant accepting that my own son was no longer just a lost man, but an active accomplice in a crime against me. March gave way to April 2022. The almond trees were beginning to bloom, but inside me, something else was germinating, a steely determination. One afternoon, I traveled in silence with Raymond and Sarah to the notary's office in Milwaukee. None of the three spoke a word during the journey. The miles passed under a gray sky, and with every curve in the road, I remembered moments of a broken motherhood. Michael's small hands holding mine, his first grades in school, and now his adult face turned into a greedy mask. The notary received us formally. He had been informed by Raymond and already knew part of the background. On the table, we placed all the documentation collected over months. Audio transcripts, photographs, altered contracts, intercepted emails. He read with patience, taking notes. When he finished, he sighed like someone taking on an unpleasant task. "Mrs. Evans, this material is more than enough to start criminal proceedings, but before filing a complaint, it's wise to ensure there's no possibility of them taking anything from you along the way." I nodded. That's why I was there. My trust was already formalized, but there were details to polish. We reviewed clauses, signed addendums that guaranteed that, even if some uncertain judge came to suspect my capacity, the decisions would already be irrevocably delegated to Sarah. My granddaughter, Inez, was protected as a future beneficiary. It was, in effect, closing a lock whose key no one else could find. As I put my firm's signature on the paper, I felt a strange relief inside me. The fear of losing what I had built over decades was dissipating. I no longer depended on the will of others. My hard work was shielded in an unbreakable legal framework. Leaving the office, Sarah took my hand, a gesture she hadn't made in years. Her grip conveyed calm and pride. She knew that this step not only protected assets, but also our dignity as a true family. Raymond, for his part, maintained his usual, almost imperturbable expression. But in his eyes, I perceived the satisfaction of a hunter who has closed a circle. However, the most delicate move remained, taking the evidence to the justice system. Raymond insisted on something fundamental. Anne, you must not be the one to directly file the complaint. If your personal seal is on it, it will give them room to accuse you of scheming. I will coordinate with a contact in the police who acts discreetly. Your daughter will be registered as a secondary witness. That way, they will never know when or how the process was activated. I accepted without hesitation. I had understood that the strategy required invisibility. It was not a time for public heroics, but for invisible moves until the very last second. The following days, I trained myself in patience. When I ran into Jessica on the street, I forced a smile. I even accepted a lunch where Michael was present. He spoke in a bombastic tone, boasting of supposed business deals, and promised he would soon be out of his troubles. I listened without judgment, like someone watching a cheap play. Inside, I knew there were only a few weeks left before the truth would erupt. The night before the official submission of the evidence, I didn't sleep. I sat in my favorite armchair and reviewed my life as if flipping through an album of invisible photographs. I saw my husband's youth, the innocent games of my children, the sacrifices to build every brick of the house that now defended me. I thought about the brutal contrast of seeing my firstborn conspire with strangers to declare me incompetent and annul my existence. That wound was much deeper than any cut on the forehead, and yet I found strength in the fact that I was not alone. Sarah, with her medical vocation and steady gaze, accompanied me in every decision. Raymond, with his cunning, was consolidating a robust case. Even the notary, a man accustomed to the coldness of papers, had shown a moral commitment to my cause. That small network of allies was enough to feel accompanied in this silent war. On April 5th, 2022, Raymond delivered the final folder to the police station. Inside were the recordings of Jessica arranging bribes, the video of Miller dictating the price of the false reports, the emails in which Michael promised assets that were still mine to third parties, all with dates, signatures, and proofs of authenticity. At the same time, Sarah signed a brief statement, confirming that she had heard her brother and sister-in-law planning my incapacitation. That same day, the judicial machinery was set in motion. We knew it wouldn't be fast. No one brings down a scheme like that in a matter of hours. But the seed was sown on firm ground. I, for the first time in a long time, breathed fully. I was no longer the elderly woman cornered by her son. I was a woman who had twisted fate, who had turned her pain into a strategy. When I returned to my house that afternoon, the sun was setting in a red haze over the city skyline. I watched the horizon and allowed myself to smile. The worst was yet to come, but I was convinced that every step taken was on solid rock. The legal battle had begun, and I was prepared to resist until the end. The days following the submission of evidence were deceptively calm. The file was now in the hands of the police, and what appeared to be routine hit a storm brewing in judicial offices. Meanwhile, I led an almost normal external life, walking around the neighborhood, visiting the farm, and greeting acquaintances who, knowing nothing, talked to me about the weather or the olive harvest. But inside, I felt a different heartbeat. I had crossed a point of no return. The first signs that the machinery had been activated came one April morning. Raymond visited me with a smirk he tried to hide his satisfaction. "Sitting in my living room," he told me bluntly. "They've started wiretaps. Miller and his people don't know it yet, but every word they say will be recorded, and that gives us an advantage." I shivered, aware that the invisible net was closing in on them. I thought of Michael. Was he still confident, not imagining his calls were being listened to? I pictured him, agitated, promising his creditors that the money would come, not realizing that every sentence was a shovel digging his own grave. At the same time, Jessica began to show signs of restlessness. I noticed it in a chance encounter on a busy street. She was overly nervous. She kept turning her head, as if suspecting something was wrong. She tried to start a conversation with her usual rehearsed cordiality, but her voice trembled. "Your son worries a lot about you, Anne. You should think about resting from so many responsibilities," she said. That sentence, which in another context might have sounded like a kind gesture, struck me as grotesque, almost sinister, knowing that her maneuvers were already being documented. Sarah constantly advised me to be cautious. "Don't give any signs, Mom. Let them believe they're still in control." I followed her instructions to the letter. In public, I showed calm, even at family gatherings where Michael would reappear without speaking to me directly. He communicated more with haughty looks and gestures of superiority than with words. He thought silence was dominance, when in reality it was ignorance of what was already underway. At the end of April, the first visible reaction occurred. Official raids on Samuel Miller's law firm. Raymond was the first to inform me. He had a source inside who confirmed how agents had left the office with boxes full of documents, seized computers, and confiscated papers. That image, although I didn't see it with my own eyes, was so vivid that I imagined it in full detail. The lawyer sweating, feigning surprise, as years of corruption were packed away in sealed evidence folders. The news spread discreetly in certain circles, and it was impossible for it not to reach the ears of Jessica and Michael. That same week, I received an unexpected call from my son. His voice was different, laden with anxiety. "Mom, we need to talk. This is all getting complicated." I listened in silence, responding with nothing more than a curt, "Whenever you're ready." I offered no reproaches or indulgence, only a calculated neutrality. I hung up and stared at the dark screen of the phone for a long time. His disguised plea was confirmation that he could already feel the disaster approaching. Jessica, however, reacted differently. Instead of seeking dialogue, she chose to distance herself. She stopped appearing at family gatherings, didn't respond to trivial messages, and some neighbors mentioned seeing her hurriedly at ATMs and courier offices. Raymond suspected she was trying to move money to foreign accounts before it was too late. Meanwhile, the official investigation progressed. Sarah, with her clinical composure, explained to me what the judicial orders, the requested expert reports, and the soon-to-come summonses meant. I nodded, grateful that she put technical words to what I only saw as a hazy horizon. Seeing her so determined sustained me with unexpected strength. In that context, I understood that, beyond the pain, I was also witnessing the rebirth of the noblest bond between a mother and her daughter. In May, we received confirmation that the registered trust was now officially recognized in the corresponding records. That news was like a final shield. Even if some trick succeeded, my properties could not be transferred without Sarah's signature. That certainty was a balm in the midst of the storm. However, Michael didn't give up. He appeared at my door one afternoon, his face haggard, his gaze evasive, and a cigarette burning between his nervous fingers. "Mom, you have to get me out of this. Don't you understand? There are dangerous people involved," he stammered, avoiding looking at me directly. I just watched him, remembering the boy he once was. I didn't answer yes or no. I knew my words would be useless. He was already trapped in his own mire. Finally, he left, leaving behind a trail of smoke and desperation. That night I understood that the judicial process was no longer just my defense. It was the mirror in which my son would see the magnitude of his degradation reflected. Jessica would continue to pull her strings. Miller would boast of manipulating laws in his favor. But in reality, each of them was cornered. And I, in my apparent silence, was certain that the storm would soon break. The siege was no longer a project. It was a tangible reality. And when the first blows of the battle reached their heads, I wouldn't need to scream or seek revenge. I would just be left standing, with the serenity of someone who transformed betrayal into victory. The day of the family confrontation arrived without me seeking it. Sometimes life places you in an unavoidable scene, as if the entire script were written in advance. It was mid-May 2022. At my brother's house in the countryside, we had a meeting of a seemingly trivial nature, a Sunday lunch where, they said, we would try to ease tensions. I went with no expectations, accompanied by Sarah, but with the certainty that, sooner or later, the explosion would happen face to face. As soon as we entered, I felt the heavy atmosphere. My brothers, David and Robert looked serious, aware that something grave was hovering around the family. Michael was there, sitting in a corner, with a dejected expression and sunken eyes. Jessica didn't show up, which didn't surprise me. For weeks she had preferred the shadows to the spotlight. Sarah went to say hello, radiating a firm calm that contrasted with the tension in the air. Only a few minutes passed before Michael decided to break the silence. He slammed his fist on the table, spilling some wine, and with a broken, almost hysterical voice he exclaimed, "Mom, that's enough. You're destroying my life." I looked at him intently. I didn't respond immediately. I wanted silence to be my first answer, a wall against his theatrics. He continued, "What are you trying to do? See me ruined? I'm your son. How can you let them judge me, persecute me, humiliate me like this?" His words pierced me, but not like before. This time I didn't feel the tremor of fear or the anguish of guilt. What I felt was an icy clarity. I took a deep breath, and calmly, I spoke. "Michael, I'm not the one destroying your life. You are, with every lie, every debt, every forged signature. I just stopped protecting you like I always did." The impact of my sentences was harder than any blow. My brothers lowered their gazes, as if they found it hard to bear the tension. Sarah stood tall, as both a witness and a support. He tried to interrupt me, but I raised my hand and continued. "For years I thought blood justified silences and forgiveness. I believed that one day you would wake up and understand that your mother wasn't an enemy, but I was wrong. The only thing I did was feed your greed. And that night, when you broke a bottle on my forehead and screamed that I should rot, I finally understood the root of your contempt." His face contorted, a mix of anger and shame. I pushed even further. "Now I know you were planning with Jessica and Miller to have me declared incompetent to take everything that belongs to me. But what you didn't know is that I got ahead of you. My assets are already protected. Your plan is dead." A scorching silence filled the room. I could even hear the creak of the floorboards under my brother Robert's feet. Michael's eyes widened in disbelief. He stammered, "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," I replied with a firm voice, "that every conversation, every email, every negotiation is in the hands of the justice system, and soon it won't be you taking anything from me, but the law that will hold you accountable for what you did." My son's face fell apart. He went from fury to panic in a matter of seconds. I saw in his gaze that spark of awareness that the ground beneath his feet had collapsed. And it was not a pleasant sight for a mother. Inside, my heart ached with pain, but I couldn't show weakness. Then Michael stood up abruptly, knocking his chair over, and shouted in a desperate attempt to regain authority, "You're condemning me! You're sending me to prison!" Sarah stepped between us with surprising serenity and said, "No, Michael, you sent yourself. The day you agreed to sell our mother's dignity." My son lowered his head. For a moment, I saw him as fragile, like that little boy with big eyes who used to ask me to take him to the park. But that boy was gone. He had been replaced by a man who chose to sink into the cruelest greed. I approached slowly, without raising my voice, and said to him, "I have nothing left to give you. You have lost the right to demand my love without showing respect. From today on, you are responsible for your actions and the price they will carry." No one spoke after those words. Michael fled the room without looking back, leaving a dense silence in his wake. My brothers sighed heavily, aware that this fracture could not be healed. Sarah took my hand and restored my calm with a tender gesture. That night, back in my house, I felt a strange pain. It wasn't the fear that had paralyzed me in previous months. It was a kind of mourning. I understood that I had lost a son while he was still alive, not because he was dead, but because he had chosen paths of betrayal that were impossible to redeem. And in that grief, I understood that the confrontation was necessary. Only then was the truth exposed before close witnesses, and only then had I sealed with my own voice the boundary between victim and adversary. There would be no naive reconciliation. All that was left was to wait for justice to move forward, implacably, with the certainty that my old silence had given way to resistance. May turned into a month of shocks. After the confrontation at my brother's house, silence became a strange ally. I knew it wouldn't be long before the authorities made their final move, although I didn't know when or how the orders would be executed. I lived each morning as if it were a prelude to an impending storm. The response came on May 18th, 2022. It was just after 8 a.m. when Raymond entered my house with a hurried step, though still with his characteristic serenity. He informed me that the police had executed several simultaneous raids in Chicago: Miller's office, a property belonging to Jessica, and the apartment where Michael spent most of his nights. I stood still, unable to react immediately. It was the culmination of months of investigation, but seeing it materialize was unsettling. Raymond continued. They've arrested Samuel. They found him with forged documents and a list of cash payments. Michael is also under temporary arrest for assault and attempted fraud. Jessica has disappeared. Those words hit me like a gust of wind. I imagined Miller, the arrogant lawyer, facing the agents storming his firm, dismantling the facade of respectability with which he had covered his schemes for years. I could see him with sweat running down his forehead and his eyes darting, aware that there was no escape. Thinking of Michael in custody shook me in a different way. The image of my son being handcuffed, reduced to a mere number in a case file, was the most painful picture I could conceive. However, I knew it was inevitable. The line between saving him and being his accomplice had been crossed long ago. Jessica's case was different. Her disappearance didn't surprise me. I had always observed in her a cold cunning, a survival instinct that stopped at nothing. Raymond suspected she might have fled to France, where she had family contacts, taking with her what little she could still control. For me, her escape was an explicit admission of guilt. Her name would remain as an echo of betrayal in our family's memory. In the following days, I was summoned to give a statement in court. I entered that room with a steady breath. My head was held high, my dark suit was well pressed, and I had the calm of someone who knows the facts are on their side. The judge listened to me for over an hour. I recounted Michael's assault that September night, the attempts to declare me incompetent, the evidence gathered by Raymond, and finally, the trust that secured my inheritance. Every sentence was a release of the weight I had carried on my shoulders for months. Samuel Miller was prosecuted for document forgery, bribery, and criminal association. His fall was so swift that, in a matter of days, his name went from being on golden plaques in downtown Chicago to occupying headlines in the local press as an example of professional corruption. His colleagues rushed to distance themselves from him, and his figure became a symbol of the degradation of a noble profession. Michael remained in preventive detention, facing charges of assault with injury and attempted fraud. I visited him only once during his detention. It wasn't a planned meeting, but an unavoidable crossing in the courthouse hallways. He approached me with an unsure step, his eyes red from sleepless nights. His lips moved, searching for words, but I didn't let him speak. I simply uttered a sentence that had been building up inside me for months. Son, blood is no excuse to erase what you've done. Let the law decide now. And I walked away, leaving behind a shadow of what was once my firstborn. The paradox of that period was that while the guilty parties fell one by one, I didn't feel the euphoria of victory. There was no satisfaction in seeing handcuffs sealing fates or in reading headlines that confirmed what we already knew. What I felt was a mixture of relief and mourning. I had protected my assets, but I had lost a part of my own history. That contradiction accompanied me every morning. Society, on the other hand, was quick to react. Neighbors and acquaintances began to approach me with words of support, some with an admiring tone. "Anne, what integrity you've shown. Not everyone could have resisted as you did." I would smile discreetly, aware that behind those words there was also surprise at seeing how a seemingly fragile woman had defeated such a sinister scheme. Sarah became my silent support. She organized my medical appointments, supervised my regular treatments, and at the same time coordinated meetings with the notary to ensure everything that was signed remained unchangeable. Her presence was a reminder that loyalty did exist in the family, even if it came from only one side. The months passed, and I learned that Jessica had crossed the border into Lyon. There she took refuge at a cousin's house, trying to rebuild her life while carrying the legal stain that would follow her for life. I had no need to see or hear from her again. Her name, for me, was buried under the memory of betrayal. Looking back, I understood that the entire process had been like crossing a desert, with the certainty that an oasis awaited on the other side. Every step hurt, every moment of uncertainty threatened to make me fall, but in the end, I managed to arrive safely. Not intact, because the wound of a child never fully heals, but strengthened in the conviction that dignity has no price. By the end of summer 2022, the justice system had already set most of the processes in motion. I, for my part, found serenity in the everyday. Having breakfast with Sarah, walking through the olive groves, reading in the quiet afternoons, my life was no longer defined by the fear of betrayal, but by the certainty of having faced it. And I understood that, although family defeats are the cruelest, sometimes it is necessary to build a wall and allow justice to penetrate where love has failed. The summer of 2022 found me changed. I was not the same woman who had bled in silence at a party months earlier. Nor was I that mother who still wanted to justify a son's mistakes in the name of love. I was, rather, someone who had crossed the threshold of fear and had learned to redefine the word family. Sarah became a constant beacon. Her presence was like a balm after the storm. She accompanied my daily routines with a mix of tenderness and firmness. In her gestures, I perceived not only the devotion of a daughter, but also the determination of a woman who had seen too much pain in hospitals to allow her own home to become another stage for injustice. With her, I rediscovered the tranquility of small rituals. The aroma of coffee at 7 in the morning, long walks among olive trees, the shared silence of afternoons spent reading. The news that Michael would remain in custody until his trial shook me to the core. Not because I believed the measure was unjust, but because I understood that the young man who was once my pride had ended up as the protagonist of his own downfall. I accepted it as a form of mourning, a living son, but lost forever in the shadow of his bad decisions. And although I thought of him every night, I understood that I should not harbor false hopes. There are paths that, once chosen, have no return. Of Jessica, only rumors arrived. We learned through contacts that she was taking refuge in Lyon, trying to survive on favors from others, hounded by debts and the shadow of an open criminal case in the U.S. I felt no desire to pursue her, no additional resentment. She had fled with the only thing she had left, her instinct for self-preservation. To me, she was already an absent figure. As the months passed, I understood that what I had gained was not just the protection of my assets. The essential thing was the conquest of my own serenity. For too long, I had lived subjected to emotional blackmail, to the pressure of maintaining harmony at any cost. The sadness born from this betrayal taught me that unconditional love can be a deadly trap if it is confused with submission. Affection needs boundaries, because otherwise it becomes the perfect weapon for manipulators. With Sarah, we decided to give a new meaning to the future. Inspired by her medical work, she proposed creating a small foundation to support elderly people suffering abuse from their own families. Many of them arrived at hospitals beaten, stripped of their properties, or psychologically broken, without knowing where to turn. The idea that my experience could be transformed into help for others gave me a purpose beyond revenge. In September 2022, we signed the first documents to establish the foundation. We gave it a simple name: Dignity Alive. There we would begin to allocate part of my real estate income to offer free legal and medical assistance to elderly victims of abuse. Seeing that project born restored the hope I thought was dead. It was like planting a new olive tree in fertile ground. I wouldn't see it grow completely, but I knew it would bear fruit for others in the future. My granddaughter Ines, at just 12 years old, became an additional reason to stay strong. I watched her run through the yard, study at the living room table, and I understood that there was still much to protect. Not just material goods, but values. She would grow up knowing that her grandmother did not give up, that loyalty is not negotiable, and that no one should tolerate humiliation, even if it comes from your closest blood relative. Every afternoon, as I sat at my desk now clear of legal files, I felt that I was finally regaining the right to enjoy my days. I stored all the folders with evidence, recordings, and documents in the back of a drawer. That chapter was over. It was not my desire to turn my old age into an endless chain of legal proceedings. The essential was already resolved. The betrayal had been uncovered and brought into the light of justice. It comforted me to look at Sarah, to see her smile again, less burdened by the anguish of the past months. She too had carried an enormous weight, yet she emerged stronger, confirming a mother-daughter bond more solid than any inheritance. The true wealth, I understood, was that complicity, that love that needed no disguises or conditions. With the passing of days, I began to write my memoirs, not for publication, but as an exercise in catharsis, to recount each stage. The night of the attack, the discovery of the conspiracy, Raymond's patient work, securing my assets, the confrontation with Michael, the police raids, the looming trial. It allowed me to close wounds. In each line I wrote, I left a weight behind, transforming it into history and not my present reality. Today, I know I cannot erase the events or recover what was lost in the bond with my son, but I do not feel defeated either. On the contrary, I have found a place of peace where I know I did the right thing, even though the price was high. Justice is not revenge. It is restored balance. I regained my dignity and safeguarded what I needed to protect. I no longer see the future with fear, but with a lucid serenity. I feel free. Free from blackmail, free from toxic dependencies, free from guilt that was never mine to bear. The betrayal may have come from within my own home, but my strength also emerged from there. From Sarah, from Inez, from the honored memory of my husband, and from the conviction that one is never too old to stand up and say enough. That is the true legacy I want to leave. That dignity is not negotiable, not even with your own blood, and that despite the losses, there is always the possibility to rebuild, to transform pain into a path to freedom. If you enjoyed this story, support us with a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave your opinions in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box that appears on the left. Thanks for being with us.